Now, more than 60,000 migrants were waiting near the U.S. Mexico border. A Border Patrol chief told CBS this. This, of course, as Title 42 ended. Border Patrol Chief Raul Ortiz says that as of Thursday, nearly 25,000 migrants were in Border Patrol holding facilities. So here to talk to me about the economic impacts of an influx of migrants into the U.S. is Sam McGregor, political economy and senior research faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. Now, Sam, I think I already know where you stand on the illegal immigration issue, so I just want to challenge you a bit, with some arguments counter to your position, just to make it a bit more interesting. So now let me ask you, can there be positive impacts economically with an influx of migrants? For example, perhaps increased economic output because illegal immigrants could contribute to the U.S. economy actually by producing goods and services and possibly purchasing goods and services themselves. And this could increase economic output. So can that stimulate economic growth?
Well, I happen to be in favor of migration per se, because I think certainly for the economic reasons, migrants, for example, start more businesses than native-born Americans. Migrants, of course, are helping to deal with the demographic problems that we have in the United States today. We're not having enough children, and until we have more children, we're going to need more migrants. Migrants are also filling up jobs in parts of the American economy where native-born Americans don't seem to want to take certain types of jobs. So all those economic benefits, I think, are very clear. But there is a problem with the illegal part of the illegal immigration. We have an absurd situation in the United States today where it's very easy to migrate to the United States illegally, but very hard to migrate here legally. It should be the opposite way around. And the illegality is partly, of course, a rule of law question. You can't just have people and governments, for that matter, just simply ignoring what the law actually says. Breakdown and corrosion of rule of law has a significant economic effect insofar as it undermines people's certainty that the laws will be followed and the laws will be obeyed and the laws will be coherently applied. So migration, I think, yes, it's a great thing. Economically, it's generally very good for the countries that experience it. And it tells you something that a lot of people want to come to America and not go to some other places. But the illegal dimension of it is a serious problem. And any reform of immigration policy, which I think should be actually much more open, requires addressing these serious rule of law questions.
And as you mentioned, it's easier for illegal immigrants to come into the country than legally. But seeing the situation now with our economy, the labor market is very tight. Illegal immigrants, can fill those shortages in certain industries and can increase productivity, competitiveness. So, maybe the situation demands that.
Well, it's certainly the case that we do need migrants to fill many of the types of jobs that we've already talked about. That's certainly true. But it's also the case that a free society and a society that takes things like equality before the law seriously rely very heavily upon rule of law. So it should be possible for us to have the types of economic benefits that you're describing as well as rule of law. Because it seems to me that it's not just the case that rule of law, or the lack of rule of law more precisely, starts to introduce a great deal of uncertainty into the legal framework within which all economic activity occurs. It also, I think, starts to threaten things like our confidence in some basic institutions of a free society. And free economies, market economies, rely very heavily upon governments and citizens adhering to the rule of law. And if you look at those economies and societies that don't have rule of law or have very weak rule of law, it's very apparent that that has major negative implications for the everyday conduct of economic life. So again, we should be able to have a good and even quite liberal migration policy, but it should and it must go hand in hand with rule of law. And that's the problem that we have now. I think a lot of people's opposition to some aspects of immigration policy, or at least migrants coming to the United States, would go away very quickly if they could be assured that this was occurring within a coherent legal framework. I think many of the objections that you hear up to immigration to the United States, or even increasing migration to the United States, would disappear across the political spectrum if there was more confidence that this was occurring within a coherent legal framework in which principles of rule of law were being adhered to.
But here's the thing, Sam. Illegal immigrants pay sales and property taxes, and some also pay income taxes. Now, they may be using false Social Security numbers. Well, this is illegal, but it still represents a net gain for the government in terms of tax revenue.
Yes, it certainly does. And of all that's everything you just said is true. They are producing, they're helping to create wealth when they come to the United States in many instances. I think fewer of them go on welfare than we realize, because after all, they're coming here for economic opportunity. Let's keep that in mind. But again, we should be able to have all those things that you just mentioned occurring and operating within a coherent legal framework for migration. Imagine what it would be like if we had all those things that you just described, which we do, but we had them operating within a system whereby people could come here legally instead of having to go through what is an incredibly inefficient, slow, and hyper-bureaucratic way of entering the country legally. So again, I think these things can be held together, but at the moment, they're not being held together. And I think, as I said, there are serious political and economic implications to violations of rule of law, which in many respects, I think, would outweigh some of the things, the very good things that you just mentioned, that migrants, including illegal migrants, bring to the United States.
Maybe just tell us, what are those implications?
Well, for example, if you're living in a society like many of the societies from which migrants are coming from, predominantly from Latin America, we're talking about societies in which property rights are not respected, in which people do not have confidence in the legal system in delivering just and equitable judgments, in which corruption is pervasive throughout the judicial system and the political system. And rule of law counteracts all those things insofar as it insists upon the basic equality of all human beings before the law, insofar as it insists upon the just application of the same laws to the same people at all times and all places. When all those things start to break down, it's not surprising that you see people starting to revert to ways of economic acting that in many respects start to erode foundations of a flourishing economy. Things like private property rights, things like the sanctity of contracts. So these are some of what you might call the institutional factors that are very important, that flow from rule of law and which help to bolster a healthy and flourishing and free economy. You take away those institutional supports, or if you let those institutional supports corrode, as we're seeing, I think, in the case of what's happening with migration policy, and which has been happening with migration policy for a long period of time, I think you start to see that the economic implications in the long term start to be very, very corrosive for the United States.
And maybe you can expand a little bit on that. The negatives that you mentioned just now, you mentioned before that it outweighs the positives that I proposed. Maybe just expand a little bit on that. How so?
Sure, because things like rule of law, equitable treatment by the legal system, etc., people conforming to just law, these are long-term commitments, right? So these are long-term institutional, political, and legal commitments to the type of society that we want to live in. It's very tempting to sort of say, well, maybe it's not so important because of this particular issue or because of some of these particular things that we need right now. Rule of law is a commitment to the long-term prosperity and freedom of any given society. So I think we see that when we're willing to put that aside because of something like some of the issues that you mentioned before. You're trading off short-term gain for long-term problems. Again, I do think we can have a coherent, generous, and pretty liberal immigration policy when it comes to people coming to the United States today, not least because it produces some of the benefits that you mentioned, as well as long-term economic benefits. But we shouldn't be in a situation, which is the one we're in right now, whereby we're being asked to trade off some of those economic gains for some of the damage that's done to rule of law by having an incoherent and inconsistent immigration system, and whereby the government, in many instances, is ignoring its own laws when it comes to migration policy.
All right, thank you, Sam. Pleasure speaking to you today.
Thanks for having me on.
Migrants have been expelled more than 2.7 million times under Title 42. Daily apprehensions rose above 10,000 this weekend. Detention capacity maxed out. Now, Trump first implemented Title 42 in March 2020 during the pandemic.